A millionaire finds a lost boy in the subway. An innocent drawing and an ancient necklace reveal a connection to the past. The search for truth leads him to face his biggest demons. The lonely boy holds a secret that puts the millionaire at risk of losing everything. Richard Thompson observed his reflection in the window of the New York subway, discreetly adjusting the Italian tie that had cost more than many earn in a month. At 45, his imposing figure and tailored suit reflected the success he had achieved, but his brown eyes carried a melancholy that not all the money in the world could mask. The car was packed, as it always was in the late afternoon. Executives, students, and workers crammed into the limited space, each lost in their own world. Richard checked the platinum watch on his wrist once more, a gift he had given himself, after closing his first million-dollar deal. He was late for yet another meaningless meeting, another empty commitment in his perpetually full schedule. Suddenly, a violent jolt shook the car. The lights flickered, and the train came to an abrupt halt, eliciting gasps of surprise and irritation from the passengers. The sound system crackled with an automated message about technical issues and the need to wait a few minutes. Richard sighed, resigned. His gaze wandered through the car, observing people's reactions. Some complained loudly, others buried themselves even deeper in their phones. It was then that he noticed something unusual. A boy, no more than 10 years old, sitting alone on one of the benches across the aisle. There was something peculiar about the child. It wasn't just that he was unaccompanied, but his posture, the way he observed everything around him with a mix of fascination and apprehension. He wore simple but clean clothes, a blue t-shirt, jeans, and slightly worn white sneakers. His small hands gripped a red backpack firmly on his lap. Richard tried to ignore it, turning his attention back to his phone. He answered a few emails, checked stock prices, but his eyes kept drifting back to the lonely figure of the boy. A distant memory began to poke at his consciousness, recollections of his own childhood, of moments of solitude he preferred to keep buried under layers of professional success. The minutes dragged on. The air conditioning stopped working, and the heat began to build up in the car. People grew increasingly restless. Richard noticed that the boy seemed more and more anxious, his large eyes scanning the surroundings with growing concern. Against his better judgment, Richard found himself rising from his seat. His Italian shoes echoed on the metal floor as he crossed the aisle. He stopped in front of the boy, who looked up with an expression that mixed curiosity and caution. "Hello," Richard said, his voice softer than usual. "Are you okay? Are you alone?" The boy hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, no. I was with someone, but—" His voice was low, almost a whisper. Richard sat down in the empty space beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. "My name is Richard. What's yours?" "Michael," the boy replied, still hesitant. "Michael," Richard repeated, and something about the way he said the name made his heart tighten inexplicably. "Who were you with?" Michael began, but his response was cut off by another jolt of the train, which came back to life. The car's light stabilized, and the air conditioning started working again. "Attention passengers," a metallic voice announced over the sound system. "The technical issue has been resolved. We will continue our journey as usual. We apologize for the inconvenience." The train began to move, and Richard realized he couldn't just go back to his seat and leave the boy there. There was something in his eyes, a familiar loneliness that resonated deeply with his own experience. "Michael, do you know where you're going?" The boy gripped his backpack tighter. I think so. It's near Central Park." Richard frowned. That subway line didn't go toward Central Park. Before he could question further, he noticed something even more intriguing, a small golden pendant peeking out from the collar of Michael's shirt. For a split second, he thought he recognized the design engraved on the metal, but the boy quickly tucked it back in. The train stopped at the next station, and several people got off, replaced by a new wave of passengers. Richard made a decision that would change his life forever. "Michael, if you want, I can help you find your way." The boy studied him for a long moment, as if assessing his sincerity. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice carrying a tone of relief that made Richard wonder how long he had really been lost. As the train continued its journey through the dark tunnels of Manhattan, Richard couldn't have imagined that this chance encounter on the subway would be just the beginning of a journey that would force him to confront not only his past, but also the choices that had shaped him into the man he was today. Their first stop was at a diner near the station. Richard watched Michael devour a burger with fries, thinking about how to discreetly cancel his afternoon commitments. While the boy ate, he tried to extract more information, but the answers were vague and sometimes contradictory. "You said you live near Central Park," Richard began, stirring his untouched coffee. "Can you give me the exact address?" Michael chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on his plate. "It's a big house, with a white fence and a garden in front. There are many houses like that in New York," Richard replied patiently. "Do you remember the name of the street?" The boy furrowed his brow as if trying to concentrate. "I think Maple Street." Richard nearly dropped his cup. Maple Street wasn't in New York. It was the name of the street where he had grown up, in Chicago, United States, a street he hadn't visited in over 2 decades. "Michael," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "are you Brazilian?" The boy nodded, seeming relieved to be able to answer something with certainty. "Yes, I was born there." "How did you end up in New York?" "I came with." Michael hesitated again, his gaze drifting to the window of the diner. Outside, people hurried past on the sidewalk, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside. Richard noticed that whenever pressed for specific details, Michael seemed to withdraw. He decided to change tactics. "You know, I was also born in Brazil," he commented casually, watching the boy's reaction. "In fact, I knew a street called Maple when I was a kid." Michael's eyes lit up momentarily. "Really? What was it like there?" "It was a quiet street with lots of trees," Richard replied, allowing himself to dive into memories he had long kept locked away. "There was a bakery on the corner that made the best cheese bread in the neighborhood." "The Golden Bakery!" Michael exclaimed, to Richard's astonishment. A shiver ran down his spine. The Golden Bakery had closed over 15 years ago. How could Michael know about it? Before he could ask more, he noticed a suspicious movement through the window. A man in a dark suit was standing across the street, seemingly looking in his direction. When their eyes met, the stranger quickly looked away and began walking, disappearing into the crowd. "Michael," Richard said, trying to keep his voice casual, while his mind raced, "do you know that man?" The boy looked out the window, but the stranger was already gone. "What man?" Richard shook his head, telling himself he was getting paranoid. "Nothing important. Listen, we need to find a safe place for you to stay while we figure out how to contact your family." "No," Michael said abruptly, his face losing some color. "I mean, I can't. Not yet." The boy's reaction only heightened Richard's suspicions that there was much more to this story than met the eye. He picked up his phone and started dialing the police, but Michael grabbed his arm. "Please," the boy pleaded, "don't call anyone. Hi, I need to show you something first." Richard hesitated, his finger hovering over the call button. Logic told him he should contact the authorities immediately, but something in Michael's gaze, a mix of fear and pleading, made him reconsider. "What do you want to show me?" Michael opened his backpack and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "This was with me when I came here." Richard carefully took the envelope. It was sealed and addressed to him at his old address on Maple Street. The handwriting. His heart skipped a beat. It was identical to his mother's. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I can't say yet," Michael replied, his eyes pleading. "But there are more things you need to see. Important things." Richard looked at the envelope in his hands, then at the boy in front of him, and finally at the busy street through the window. The man in the suit had reappeared, this time on the other side of the street, pretending to read a newspaper. A decision needed to be made. His carefully constructed life, his meetings, his commitments, all seemed insignificant in the face of the mystery before him. That envelope, that boy, the impossible coincidences, there was only one choice to make. "All right," he finally said, putting away his phone. "Let's go to my apartment. We can talk more calmly there." As he paid the bill and prepared to leave, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The mysterious man had disappeared again, but the sense of unease lingered. Something told him this was only the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. Richard's apartment occupied the top 2 floors of one of the most exclusive buildings in Manhattan. As the elevator rose silently, he observed Michael through the reflection in the mirrored doors. The boy seemed smaller now, almost intimidated by the opulence of the place, his eyes scanning the gold details of the elevator with a mix of awe and discomfort. The doors opened directly into the penthouse, revealing a space that resembled a modern art gallery. Valuable works adorned the white walls, and a panoramic view of New York stretched through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Wow," Michael whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. Richard walked to the brushed steel kitchen, leaving his briefcase on the marble counter. "Would you like something to drink? Water, juice?" "Water, please," Michael replied, still standing near the elevator, as if afraid to move and break something. As he poured water into a crystal glass, Richard thought about how his life had completely changed in just a few hours. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't focused on meetings, contracts, or stock quotes. He was intrigued, worried, and, surprisingly, more alive than he had felt in a long time. "You can sit," he said, pointing to the Italian leather sofa in the living room. Michael crossed the room carefully, still clutching his red backpack. Richard handed the glass of water to the boy and sat down in a nearby armchair. He pulled the yellowed envelope from his coat pocket, studying it again. The paper was aged, but not as much as it should have been if it were from the time when his mother still lived on Maple Street. "Michael," he began softly, "I need you to tell me the truth. How did you get this envelope?" The boy took a sip of water, his fingers nervously tapping on the glass. "You won't believe me." "Try." Michael took a deep breath. "I got it from a lady. She told me I needed to find you, that it was important." "What lady?" Richard asked, leaning forward. "She—" Michael hesitated, his eyes filling with tears. "She looked a lot like you. She had the same eyes." Richard felt his heart race. "Where did you meet her?" "On Maple Street. She was sitting on the bench in the square, the one near the apple tree." The description was too precise to be a coincidence. The bench under the apple tree was where his mother used to sit every afternoon, watching the children play. But that was impossible. She had moved away from there decades ago. "When did this happen?" "A week ago, I think." Michael frowned, as if trying to organize his memories. "Time is a bit fuzzy in my head." Richard stood up, walking to the window. The sun was beginning to set, painting the New York sky with shades of orange and pink. His mind struggled to process the conflicting information. How could Michael have been in the United States a week ago if he knew details about a place that no longer existed? A movement on the street caught his attention. The man in the dark suit was down there, standing on the sidewalk in front of the building. Even from a distance, Richard could feel his gaze fixed on the penthouse windows. "Michael," he called, without taking his eyes off the mysterious figure. "Do you know that man down there?" The boy cautiously approached the window. As soon as he spotted the stranger, he took a few steps back, knocking over the glass of water. The crystal shattered on the marble floor. "Sorry!" Michael exclaimed, crouching down to try to gather the shards. "Leave it," Richard said, more concerned with the boy's reaction to seeing the man. "Michael, who is he?" He's looking for me," Michael replied, his voice trembling. "But I can't go with him, not yet. There's something I need to do first." Richard closed the curtains with a sharp motion and knelt in front of the boy. "Michael, if you're in danger, you need to tell me. I can help, but I need to know what's going on." The boy bit his lip, his eyes filling with tears again. Then slowly, he removed the golden pendant Richard had noticed on the subway. It was an oval locket with a family crest engraved on its surface. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. It was his family's crest, the same one his mother always wore on an identical necklace, an item he hadn't seen in over 20 years. "Where—" his voice faltered. "Where did you get this?" "The lady gave it to me along with the envelope," Michael replied, handing the locket to Richard. "She said that when I found you, I should show you this first. Then You could open the envelope." With trembling hands, Richard picked up the locket. It was heavy, just as he remembered. As he turned it over, he found the inscription he knew would be there. "Forever with love, 1985. His legs weakened, and he had to lean against the wall. 1985, the year his mother had received that necklace from his father. The year everything began to change. "There's one more thing," Michael said, opening his backpack. "She gave me this too." He pulled out a small photo album, its brown leather cover worn by time. Richard recognized it instantly. It was the family album that had gone missing during the move, along with so many other precious memories. The photo album rested between them on the coffee table like a bridge between the past and the present. Richard hesitated to open it, his hands hovering over the aged leather cover. Beside him, Michael watched with an almost reverent curiosity. "Have you looked inside it?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Michael shook his head. "She said it was only for you to see." Finally, Richard gathered his courage and opened the album. The first photo hit him like a punch to the gut. His whole family, smiling in front of the house on Maple Street. His mother, Helen, radiant in a floral dress. His father, Anthony, with that characteristic smile he rarely showed in public. And himself at 12 years old, holding a trophy from a school chess championship. "Is that the woman who gave you the envelope?" he asked, pointing to his mother in the photo. "Yes," Michael exclaimed, leaning in for a closer look. "Except, she looked more, I don't know how to explain it. Different but the same." Richard continued flipping through the pages, each image bringing back long-buried memories. Birthdays, graduations, family trips, moments he had forced himself to forget during his rise to business success. One photo in particular caught his attention. It showed him at 15 sitting on the park bench under the apple tree, playing chess with his father. What surprised him wasn't the image itself, but what was in the background, a boy who looked remarkably like Michael, watching the game. "Impossible," Richard murmured, bringing the photo closer to his eyes. "What is it?" Michael asked, trying to see. Richard showed the photo to the boy. "Do you see that child in the background?" Michael studied the image for a moment, his eyes widening. It looks like me." "But this photo was taken 30 years ago," Richard said, more to himself than to Michael. "How is this possible?" Before they could explore this bizarre discovery further, the apartment intercom buzzed, making both of them jump. Richard walked over to the wall panel and pressed the button to answer. "Mr. Thompson," the doorman's voice sounded concerned. "Sorry to bother you, but there's a man down here insisting on speaking with you. He says he's from the Brazilian consulate." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "Did he identify himself?" "Yes, sir. He showed an official document, said it's about a missing child." Michael grabbed his backpack, his eyes wide with fear. "We can't let him come up. He's not who he says he is." Richard looked at the boy for a moment, torn between the logic that said to cooperate with the authorities and his gut feeling that something was wrong. "Tell him I'm not here," Richard finally replied to the doorman. "And please, don't let him come up." Hanging up the intercom, Richard began pacing back and forth, his mind racing. If that man really was from the consulate, he was making a serious mistake by not cooperating. But the coincidences were too unsettling. His mother's locket, the lost album, the impossible photo. "Michael," he said, stopping in front of the boy, "I need you to trust me now. There's something much bigger going on here, isn't there?" The boy nodded slowly. "She said you'd understand when the time was right, that everything would make sense when you saw what was inside the envelope." Richard picked up the yellowed envelope that was still on the table. He studied the familiar handwriting once more, feeling the weight of decades at his fingertips. "If I open this now," he said, "there's no turning back, is there?" "No," Michael replied simply. With a deliberate motion, Richard began to open the envelope. The paper gave way easily, as if it had been sealed recently, not decades ago. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper, carefully folded. Before he could unfold it, however, he heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Impossible, since his apartment occupied the entire floor. Michael grabbed his arm. "They found another way," the boy whispered, panic in his voice. "We need to go now." Richard quickly tucked the letter into the inner pocket of his jacket and grabbed his keys. "Come with me," he said, guiding Michael toward a discreet door near the kitchen. "There's an emergency staircase that leads to the garage." As they hurried down the stairs, Richard could hear the sound of more footsteps above them. His heart pounded furiously in his chest, and 1,000 questions swirled in his mind. Who were those people? Why were they after Michael? And more importantly, what was the truth contained in that letter that someone so desperately wanted to prevent him from reading? The underground garage of the building was a maze of concrete and shadows. Richard guided Michael between rows of luxury cars, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The air was heavy with the smell of gasoline and rubber. "This way," Richard whispered, heading toward a more secluded corner where his black Porsche was parked. It was his least flashy car, if a Porsche could ever be considered discreet. As they approached the vehicle, the distant sound of doors opening made them stop. Voices echoed through the garage, reverberating in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint their exact origin. "Get in," Richard said quietly, unlocking the car with the remote. Michael slid into the passenger seat as Richard took the wheel. The engine purred softly as he turned the key. Through the rearview mirror, he saw 2 figures emerging from the emergency staircase. Without turning on the headlights, he shifted into gear and began to move silently through the garage. "Stay down," he instructed Michael, who immediately crouched in the seat. Richard maintained a steady speed, trying to appear like just another resident heading out for an evening commitment. When they reached the exit ramp, Richard saw the man in the dark suit standing by the parking booth, talking to the security. "God!" His heart raced, but he kept his composure, slowing down as if he were going to stop. The security guard signaled for him to stop, but at the last moment, Richard floored the accelerator. The Porsche shot up the ramp, passing inches from the mysterious man who jumped to the side. "Hold on!" Richard shouted as he took a sharp right turn, the tires screeching on the asphalt. Michael gripped the seat, his red backpack tightly pressed against his chest. Through the rearview mirror, Richard saw 2 dark cars exiting the garage. "Don't open your eyes yet," he told Michael, focusing on the traffic ahead. Years of experience driving in Chicago proved useful on the streets of Manhattan. Richard weaved between taxis and buses with surgical precision, taking advantage of every gap in traffic. His mind, usually occupied with numbers and negotiations, was entirely focused on the task of shaking off their pursuers. "Richard," Michael called, his voice trembling slightly, "can I tell you something?" "Of course," he replied, making another sharp turn. "The lady, your mom, she said you'd do exactly this." Richard nearly lost control of the car. "What do you mean?" "She said you'd protect me, that you'd drive really fast to escape the bad guys, just like you used to do when you were young with your red car." The air left Richard's lungs. His first car had been a red Volkswagen, which he used to drive at high speeds through the streets of Chicago, much to his mother's dismay. It was a detail he had never shared with anyone. "Michael," he said, his voice softer now, "how do you know these things?" Before the boy could answer, one of the pursuing cars pulled up beside them, trying to force them onto the sidewalk. Richard reacted instinctively, downshifting and letting the pursuer pass, then making a sudden left turn into a side street. "Do you trust me?" he asked Michael. The boy nodded without hesitation. Richard smiled, recognizing in Michael's eyes the same unconditional trust his mother had always shown. "Great, now hold on." With a series of precise maneuvers, he drove the Porsche through alleys and side streets, using his knowledge of the city to confuse the pursuers. Finally, after several minutes of chase, there was no longer any sign of the mysterious cars. Slowing down to avoid drawing attention, Richard drove to a quiet residential neighborhood in the Upper West Side. He parked the car on a tree-lined street, turned off the engine, and finally allowed himself to relax a little. "Are you okay?" he asked Michael. The boy nodded, looking surprisingly calm. "You drive just like in the stories." "What stories?" "The ones your mom told me about you." Michael opened his backpack and pulled out something that made Richard's heart stop. a small golden key attached to a faded blue ribbon. "This is the key to your secret vault," Michael finished. "The one you built at the bottom of the garden. When you were 13, she said you'd need it today." Richard took the key with trembling hands. It was impossible. That hiding place had been his most precious secret in his teenage years. Not even his mother knew about it, or at least that's what he had always believed. "How did she know?" he murmured. "There's a lot more she knows," Michael replied enigmatically. "And now it's time for you to find out too. But first," he pointed to the envelope in Richard's pocket, "you need to read the letter." Under the soft glow of the streetlights, Richard finally opened the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper, instantly recognizing his mother's elegant handwriting. The letter was dated the day before. "My dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means Michael has managed to find you. I know you must be confused, perhaps even scared by everything that's happening. The coincidences, the memories, the objects from the past, none of this is by chance. First, I need you to know that Michael is special. He has a unique gift for connecting people, times, and places. That's why he knows things he shouldn't know, why he can be in places he shouldn't be. He is a bridge between what was and what could be. You must be wondering how I could have written this letter yesterday, how I could have given Michael objects that disappeared decades ago. The answer is complex, yet simple. Sometimes love is so strong that it can bend the rules of time. Do you remember the day you left? It was 22 years ago. You were hurt, confused, convinced that you had been betrayed by your own family. Those men, the same ones now pursuing Michael, made you believe lies. They manipulated documents, planted evidence, all to tear our family apart. For years I tried to reach you, but you had built walls so high around yourself that no love could penetrate. I watched you become a successful man, but I also saw the loneliness in your eyes. The same eyes you have now as you read this letter. Michael is not just a lost boy you found on the subway. He is the key to uncovering the truth about our past, about the people who destroyed our family. But more importantly, he is your chance to reclaim something you lost long ago, your ability to trust, to love, to connect. The key he gave you opens more than that old hiding spot in the garden. It opens doors you closed in your heart. In the secret vault, you kept your childhood treasures, rare trading cards, notes from your first girlfriend, your grandfather's pocket watch. But there was something more important, a journal. In that journal, you recorded your suspicions about the men who started visiting our house back then. Your teenage observations were more accurate than you realized. That's why they needed to push you away. You were too close to the truth. Now those same men have discovered Michael. They know that through him the truth could come to light. That's why they are so desperate to find him. Son, I know it seems impossible to believe all of this, but look into Michael's eyes. Do you see something familiar in them? Something that reminds you of afternoons playing chess under the apple tree, of whispered conversations late at night about your dreams and fears? You have a choice to make now. You can continue living in the fortress you built for yourself, surrounded by wealth but empty of true connections. Or you can trust in Michael, in your memories, in the love our family always shared. The next step of this journey must take you back to Maple Street. Yes, I know you swore you'd never return there. But it is only by facing your past that you can build a different future. Michael knows the way. Trust him as you would trust yourself. And Richard, my beloved son, remember, sometimes we need to lose ourselves to find ourselves again. With all my love, Mom P.S. That day at the chess championship, you didn't lose because you were weak. You lost because you chose to protect someone who needed the victory more than you. That has always been your true strength, even if you've forgotten it. Richard let the letter fall onto his lap, silent tears streaming down his face. Beside him, Michael waited patiently, his eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond his years. "Did you know?" Richard finally asked. "Did you know what was in the letter?" Michael shook his head. "I only knew it was important, that it would help you. Remember." "Remember what?" "Who you really are," Michael replied simply. "She said you had forgotten, but that it was still inside you. You just needed to find your way back." Richard looked at the golden key in his hand, then at the boy beside him. For the first time in decades, he felt something stir in his chest, a long-forgotten feeling of possibility, of hope. "And do you know how to get to Maple Street?" he asked. Michael smiled, a smile that seemed to light up the entire car. "Yes, I do. In fact, we're closer than you think." Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with activity as Richard and Michael disembarked. After a series of careful maneuvers to avoid being tracked, using a private jet borrowed from a friend, documents arranged through trusted contacts, they were finally back in the United States. Richard watched Michael with growing fascination. The boy seemed perfectly at ease, as if he made this trip every day. In fact, ever since they left New York, he had shown a surprising familiarity with every step of the process. "Have you been here before?" Richard asked as they crossed the airport terminal. "Often," Michael replied distractedly, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "In your mother's stories." It was disconcerting how the boy always answered in this way, blending the present and the past in a manner that defied logic. Still, after his mother's letter, Richard began to accept that there were more mysteries in the world than his rational mind could explain. They hailed a taxi, and Michael gave the driver the address without hesitation, 247 Maple Street. Richard felt his heart race. It was his old address, the place where he had grown up, where he had lived the happiest and also the most painful moments of his life. The trip from the airport to the neighborhood was a journey through time. The city had changed drastically over the past few decades, but it still held familiar elements that made Richard dive into his memories. There, Michael suddenly pointed to a bakery on the corner. "The Golden Bakery." Richard frowned. In its place stood a modern gas station. "Michael, the bakery hasn't been there for years." "Look closely," the boy insisted. For a moment, Richard thought he saw the old yellow facade, the faded sign, the iron tables on the sidewalk where he used to have breakfast with his parents. He blinked, and the vision faded, leaving only the gas station. The taxi continued on its way, turning onto increasingly familiar streets. Richard's heart beat faster with every corner. Finally, they turned onto Maple Street. The street looked different, narrower than he remembered. The old houses had been replaced by modern buildings, except for... "Impossible," Richard murmured. There stood his old house, exactly as it was in his memories. The white wall with climbing vines, the wrought iron gate, the well-kept garden, everything was preserved as if time had stood still. "How?" he asked Michael, who smiled serenely. "Some things never change," the boy replied. "They just wait for the right moment to be found again." They got out of the taxi, and Richard stood on the sidewalk, absorbing every detail. The blue windows, the flowers in the garden. They were the same ones his mother used to grow. Even the old wooden swing was still there, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. "Come," Michael said, taking his hand. "There's someone waiting for you." Richard allowed himself to be guided to the gate. His free hand tightly held the golden key that Michael had given him in New York. When he inserted it into the lock, it turned smoothly, as if it had been used just the day before. The garden was a burst of familiar colors and scents. Roses, orchids, and jasmines, his mother's favorite flowers, formed a path to the porch. And there, sitting in her favorite rocking chair, was a figure that made time stand still. Helen Thompson hadn't aged a day since the last time Richard had seen her. Her black hair still had a few silver strands at her temples, and her eyes, the same eyes he saw every morning in the mirror, shone with love and wisdom. "Mom," his voice came out as a whisper. She smiled, that smile that always had the power to make everything seem possible. "Welcome back, my son." Richard took a step forward, then another, his legs moving as if he were in a dream. Michael let go of his hand, stepping back discreetly. "But how is this possible?" Helen stood up, opening her arms. "Sometimes, son, love is stronger than time. And sometimes we need an angel to show us the way back home." Richard looked at Michael, who was watching the scene with tears in his eyes. At that moment, something clicked in his mind. A detail in the old family photos, a long-buried memory. "The boy in the photo," he said slowly, "the one who was watching us play chess, was that you?" Michael nodded. "I've always been here, Richard. waiting for the right moment to bring you back. The afternoon slowly progressed, painting the sky of Chicago with golden hues. In the living room of the old Thompson house, time seemed to flow differently. Richard was sitting on the familiar sofa, the same green sofa where he used to hide to read his adventure books as a child. Helen served tea in porcelain cups that Richard instantly recognized. They were his grandmother's favorites, supposedly lost during the move. The scent of chamomile filled the room, bringing with it a wave of comforting memories. "You must have many questions," Helen said softly, sitting in her favorite armchair. Michael was quietly sitting in a corner of the room, flipping through an old photo album. "So many that I don't even know where to begin," Richard replied, his voice choked. How is all of this possible? This house, you, Michael?" Helen smiled, that smile that always held more wisdom than it revealed. "Do you remember what your grandfather always said about time?" "That it's not a straight line," Richard recited automatically, "but a river with many branches and currents." "Exactly. And sometimes when love is strong enough, we can navigate those branches of the river, find paths that lead us back to the important moments." Richard looked at Michael, who now raised his eyes from the album. "And you? Who are you? Really?" The boy closed the album gently and stepped closer. "I'm a guardian," he said simply. "Someone who helps people find their way back when they're lost." "Like a guardian angel?" Richard asked, remembering his mother's words. "Something like that," Michael smiled. "But I prefer to think of myself more as a friend who shows up when someone really needs to reconnect with their true self." Helen stood up and walked over to an old desk in the corner of the room. From a drawer she pulled out a yellowed envelope, different from the one Michael had given Richard in New York, but with the same elegant handwriting. "This," she said, handing the envelope to Richard, "is something I wrote the day you left. Something I never had the chance to give you." With trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope. Inside were documents, receipts, and photos, evidence that proved he had been deceived. The men who had convinced him that his family had betrayed him had, in fact, orchestrated an elaborate plan to separate them. "They wanted the patent," Helen explained softly. "Your father's invention, the water purification system that could help millions of people. They knew that by splitting our family apart, it would be easier to take control of the project." "But why didn't you tell me this before? Why wait so long?" "Because you weren't ready to hear it," Michael interjected. "Sometimes we need to lose something to understand its true value. You needed to feel the emptiness, the loneliness, to truly appreciate the connections you had." Richard absorbed the words, feeling their meaning resonate deeply. He remembered the years of solitude in his luxurious apartment in New York, the empty nights filled only with financial reports and contracts. "The safe," he said suddenly, remembering the key. "Is it still there?" Helen nodded. "In the same place. Some things need to remain untouched until the right moment." Richard stood up, instinctively following the path to the backyard garden. The small hideout he had built in his teenage years was still there, camouflaged among the roots of the old oak tree. The golden key fit perfectly into the lock. Inside, he found his old diary, exactly as he had left it. But there was something more, a folder with documents he had never seen before. They were his father's original plans, detailed notes about the water purification system. "Did you keep this here?" he asked Helen, who had followed him to the garden along with Michael. "No," she replied. "Your father placed it there the night before he left. He knew that one day you would come back looking for your memories, and he wanted to make sure you would also find the truth." Richard flipped through the documents, recognizing his father's handwriting. Each page revealed not only technical details of the project, but also personal notes, hopes and dreams for a better future. "There's still time," Michael said softly. "The project can still help many people." Richard looked at the boy, then at his mother, and finally at the documents in his hands. He realized that he was being offered not just the chance to correct the mistakes of the past, but also to build something meaningful for the future. "But what about the men who followed us in New York? Are they still after these documents?" Helen smiled. "Some of them, yes, but now you're not alone to face them. And besides," she exchanged a knowing glance with Michael, We have some special friends on our side." In the house's library, Richard spread his father's documents across the large oak table. Each page revealed more details about the revolutionary water purification system that Anthony Thompson had developed decades ago, a project that could have changed the lives of millions of people. Helen brought another round of coffee, while Michael methodically organized the pages in chronological order, demonstrating a surprising understanding of the technical material. "How do you know so much about this?" Richard asked the boy. Michael smiled enigmatically. "Let's just say I've spent a lot of time with your father too." Before Richard could fully process the meaning of those words, his attention was captured by a specific set of notes. They were complex calculations describing a natural filtration process using local botanical elements. "This is brilliant," he murmured, studying the details. "Dad managed to create a system that not only purifies water, but does so sustainably and affordably for underserved communities. And that's why they wanted this project so badly," Helen explained, sitting beside him. "Imagine the profit they could make selling clean water at exorbitant prices when your father's intention was to make it accessible to everyone." Richard continued examining the documents, finding not only technical specifications, but also letters his father had written, to him, to his mother, to people who could help implement the project. "Look at this," Michael pointed to one of the letters. "Your father had connections with international humanitarian organizations. They were ready to implement the system in various communities. Until those men showed up," Richard added bitterly, "and used me to destroy it all." Helen placed her hand on his shoulder. "You were young, son. They manipulated you, using your own ambition and idealism against you." Richard closed his eyes, remembering the secret meetings, the promises of wealth and success, the evidence they had presented about his family's supposed shady dealings. How foolish he had been to believe those lies. "But it's not too late," Michael said, his voice carrying that ancient wisdom that so intrigued Richard. "The project can still make the difference your father dreamed of." "How?" Richard asked. "After all this time." "Look at this," Michael said, pulling a specific page from the documents. It was a detailed map of a region in the interior of the United States, with notes about water sources and local communities. "Your father mapped out areas where the system would be most needed," Helen explained. "And the incredible thing is that those needs still exist today." Richard studied the map, his business skills beginning to work in tandem with the desire to fulfill his father's dream. "With today's technology, we could further enhance the system, make it even more efficient and accessible. And you have something your father didn't have back then," Michael added with a smile. "What?" "Resources, connections, your business experience." The boy paused meaningfully. "And most importantly, you know who your real enemies are now." Richard nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form in his mind. Years of managing multinational companies had taught him a lot about navigating the corporate world, protecting intellectual property, and building strategic alliances. "We need to act fast," he said, organizing the documents into specific piles. "Those men in New York, they must have found out about the project somehow. That's why they were following us." "Yes," Helen confirmed. "They never really gave up. They just waited for the right moment to try again. But this time we're prepared," Michael said with conviction, "and we're not alone." As if to confirm his words, a familiar sound came from the garden, the song of a mockingbird, his father's favorite bird. Richard walked to the window and saw the bird perched on the same branch where it used to sit when he was a child. "Some things never change," Helen said softly. "They just wait patiently for the right moment to return." Richard looked at his mother, at Michael, at the documents scattered on the table, all the elements of his past and his future converging into a single moment of crystal-clear clarity. "I'll need to make some calls," he said, picking up his phone. "I have some friends in strategic positions who can help us legally protect the project before we implement it." "What about the men who followed us?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Richard smiled, a smile that blended determination and serenity. "They only have power as long as we act in the shadows. It's time to bring everything into the light, the project, their intentions, the truth about what happened to our family. Exactly as your father would have done, Helen said, pride evident in her voice. Michael stepped closer to the window, watching. The mockingbird. Do you know what your father always said about birds? Richard furrowed his brow, trying to remember. No. That they are messengers, Michael replied, his eyes gleaming with that ancient wisdom. And when a mockingbird sings, it means good. Changes are on the way. The rest of the afternoon turned into an intense planning session. Richard, using his business expertise, began structuring a plan to protect and implement his father's project. His living room, once a silent memorial to the past, now pulsed with energy and purpose. First, we need to register all the patents, Richard explained, typing quickly on his laptop. Not just in the United States, but internationally. I have a friend who's an intellectual property expert who can speed up the process. Helen watched her son with a mix of pride and nostalgia. The determined boy who used to build science projects in the garage had turned into a man capable of turning dreams into reality. Michael, on the other hand, continued to surprise with his peculiar insights. Don't forget the indigenous communities, he said, pointing to a specific area on the map. Your father had a special agreement with them. They know plants that can make the system even more efficient. Richard stopped typing, looking at the boy with renewed curiosity. How do you know that? Let's just say I've navigated many branches. Of the river of time, Michael replied with his enigmatic smile. Richard's phone rang. It was one of his contacts in New York. After a brief conversation, he hung up with a thoughtful expression. The men who followed us work for Aqua Global Incubus, he informed them, one of the largest water distribution companies in the world. And one of the least ethical, Helen added. Your father turned down an offer from them just before everything happened. Richard nodded, pieces of the puzzle falling into place in his mind. They must have found out about the project through some information leak. They're probably monitoring patents and research related to water purification. But now we have something they don't, Michael said, picking up one of the notes. The complete knowledge, the details that make the system truly work. Helena stood up and walked over to an old bookshelf. From behind some books, she pulled out a small carved wooden box. And we have this, she said, opening the box. Inside was a flash drive and a few more sheets of notes. Your father continued developing the project even after you left, she explained. He never lost hope that one day you would return and carry on his work. Richard picked up the flash drive with reverence. All this time, you kept all of this? Waiting for the right moment, Michael added, when you would be ready not just to understand the project but to protect it and use it the right way. A notification sound came from Richard's laptop. Emails were starting to come in from his contacts around the world, people responding to his call, offering support, resources, connections. It's amazing, he murmured, reading the responses. So many people willing to help. It's because they recognize the importance of the project, Helena said softly. And because they trust you, Richard. You've built a reputation for integrity, even without realizing it. Michael walked over to the window again, watching the sun begin to set. You know what's most incredible? How everything connects. The people you met in New York, the skills you developed in business, even the tough times. It all prepared you for this moment. Richard looked at the boy, a question forming on his lips. Michael, when you said you're a guardian, are there others like you? The boy smiled, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the sunset. There are many guardians, Richard. Some you can see, others you can't. But they all work for the same purpose, to help people find their true path. Helena placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. And sometimes, son, the path leads us back home, so we can start over from where we left off. Richard looked around the room at the scattered documents, the laptop with messages coming in, his mother smiling with love, Michael with his ancient wisdom. Everything seemed to be exactly where it should be. So, he said, a smile forming on his face, shall we begin this fresh start? Actually, Michael replied, his eyes shining with that special knowledge, you already began. The moment you decided to stop at that subway station and talk to a lonely boy. The sound of the mockingbird came again from the garden, louder this time as if in agreement, and for the first time in many years, Richard felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The following week passed in a whirlwind of activity. The old Thompson home had turned into an improvised operations center, with Richard coordinating an international network of allies. His knowledge of the corporate world was proving invaluable in protecting his family's legacy. The patents have been registered in 17 countries, Richard announced during a particularly busy breakfast. Helen served freshly baked cheese bread. She had resumed her old habit of cooking when she was anxious. Michael, who rarely strayed far from the discussions, was studying a new set of documents they had discovered in Anthony's office. "Look at this," he said, pushing a yellowed folder toward Richard. "Your father had already established contact with communities in Green Valley." Richard examined the documents with growing interest. "This is perfect. The region still struggles with access to clean water. It could be our pilot project." Helen smiled, placing another batch of cheese bread on the table. "Your father always said we should start with Green Valley. He believed the traditional communities there would be the ideal guardians of the project." Richard's phone rang. It was his legal team in New York. After a few minutes of conversation, he hung up with a satisfied smile. "Aqua Global Inc. is backing down," he announced. "Our patent filings caught them off guard. And apparently some of their shareholders aren't too happy to learn about their less-than-ethical tactics." "People still care about what's right," Michael remarked, his voice carrying that wisdom that never failed to surprise Richard. A gentle breeze drifted through the kitchen window, carrying the scent of flowers from the garden. Helen took a deep breath, her eyes sparkling with memories. "Your father used to say that nature always finds a way to balance things," she said. "Maybe that's what's happening now." Richard nodded, realizing how every element of his life had aligned for this moment. His years building a reputation in the corporate world, the connections he had made, even his experience with those who had tried to destroy his family, it all now served a greater purpose. "I received another interesting message," he said, checking his phone. "The Global Water Resources Foundation wants to join the project. They can provide not only funds, but also international political protection." "What about the local communities?" Michael asked, always attentive to details others might overlook. "They're already on board," Richard replied. "In fact, it was easier than we expected. Many of the elders still remember Dad and the work he started." Helen stood up and walked over to an old glass cabinet. From inside, she retrieved an object that made Richard hold his breath. It was his father's old binoculars, the ones he used on his expeditions into the countryside. "I found this yesterday," she said, handing the binoculars to Richard. "I thought you might want to use it when you visit the communities." Richard held the binoculars carefully, feeling their familiar texture. How many times had he seen his father adjusting those lenses, watching birds and studying the movement of rivers? "There's something special about it," Michael said, stepping closer to observe the object. "Something beyond what the eyes can see." As if responding to the boy's words, a reflection of light danced across the binoculars' lenses, projecting a peculiar pattern on the kitchen wall. Richard adjusted the instrument and noticed something engraved on the metal, a sequence of numbers he had never noticed before. "They're coordinates," he said after a moment of studying the numbers. "And a date, September 23rd, 1985. Helen gasped softly. "The day your father made his first discovery about the purification system." "It's not just that," Michael added, his eyes shining with that special knowledge. "It's also the day you decided you wanted to be like him, remember?" Richard closed his eyes, memories flooding his mind. Yes, he remembered that day. He was only 12 and had accompanied his father on one of his expeditions. It was when he first saw the real impact Anthony's work could have on people's lives. "The coordinates," he said, opening his eyes. They point to somewhere in Green Valley. Precisely to the place where your father found the plants that made the system possible," Helen confirmed. "He always said it all started there." "And that's where we'll start again," Richard decided, a new determination in his voice. "Not just with the technical project, but with the entire philosophy behind it. Helping people, protecting the environment, creating something that truly makes a difference. Michael smiled, that smile that seemed to hold all the secrets of the universe. Sometimes the end of one journey is just the beginning of another, even more important one. The sound of the mockingbird came again from the garden, as if approving the direction things were taking. Richard looked out the window and saw not just one, but several birds gathered on the branches of the old oak tree. "Looks like we have an interested audience," he joked. "The messengers are always watching," Michael replied enigmatically, "especially when something important is about to happen." The next morning, Richard woke before sunrise. He found Michael sitting on the porch, watching the stars that still shone in the dark sky. The boy seemed different. There was an ethereal quality to his presence, as if he were both there and somewhere else at the same time. "Couldn't sleep?" Richard asked, sitting down beside him. "Guardians don't sleep like other people," Michael replied with a small smile. "We rest in other ways." Richard nodded, realizing there was much about Michael he still didn't understand, and perhaps never fully would. "You'll be leaving soon, won't you?" "My mission is almost complete," Michael confirmed. "You've found your way back, reconnected with your family, with your purpose." A wave of emotion swept through Richard. The thought of Michael leaving caused an unexpected ache in his chest. "I'll miss you." "I'm never really far away," Michael said softly. "As your mother always says, some things never change. They just wait for the right moment to be found again." The sky began to lighten on the horizon, painting the clouds with shades of pink and orange. Helen appeared at the porch door carrying a tray with coffee and cookies. "I thought you might want a different breakfast today," she said, placing the tray on a small table. "They're the same cookies I used to make when you were a child, Richard." The familiar aroma stirred more memories. Saturday mornings spent on that same porch, planning adventures with his father, dreaming of ways to change the world. "You know," Michael said, picking up a cookie, "your father is very proud of what you're doing." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Do you see it too?" Michael nodded. He never stopped believing in you, even in the toughest moments. And now seeing you bring his project to life, the right way for the right reason. Helen sat down with them, silent tears streaming down her face. "Anthony always said that the true legacy isn't what we leave to the world, but what we plant in people's hearts. And some seeds take longer to sprout," Michael added, "but when they finally do, they're the strongest." The sun was now fully rising, its golden rays stretching across the garden. Richard noticed something extraordinary. For a moment, the light seemed to create glowing paths among the flowers, as if revealing invisible connections. "It's the web," Michael explained, noticing his awe-struck gaze. "The Guardians can see it all the time, the connections between people, places, moments. It's like a great fabric that ties everything together." "Is that what you do?" Richard asked. "Help reconnect the broken threads of that web?" "Something like that," Michael smiled. "But the most important thing is helping people realize that the connections never truly break. They just go dormant sometimes." Helen stood up and went inside, returning moments later with an old box. Inside were more photographs, letters, and to Richard's surprise, drawings he had made as a child. "Look," she said, showing one of the drawings. It was a rudimentary design for a water filtration system that Richard had sketched at 10 years old, inspired by his father's work. "You already knew, even back then," Michael remarked. "You carried the same dream, the same desire to make a difference." Richard studied the childhood drawing, recognizing elements that, surprisingly, weren't too far off from the actual project his father had developed. "Sometimes we need to come full circle," Helen said softly, "to realize that what we were searching for was inside us all along." The sound of approaching cars caught their attention. From the entrance of Maple Street, a small caravan of vehicles was approaching. It was the representatives from Green Valley communities arriving for the project's first official meeting. "It's time," Michael said, standing up. There was a different quality to his voice now, as if it came from very far away. "Are you leaving now?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. "My part of this story is complete," Michael replied, "but yours is just beginning, and it will be more extraordinary than you can imagine." Helen hugged the boy, whispering something in his ear that made his eyes sparkle. Richard felt an overwhelming emotion as he realized that the moment of farewell had arrived. "Michael!" he called out as the boy began walking toward the garden. "How will I know if I'm doing the right thing?" Michael turned around, his smile brighter than ever. "Just remember what the mockingbird always says. Good changes are always on their way as long as we keep our hearts open to receive them." And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone, not dramatically or suddenly, but gently, like morning dew dissolving under the first rays of sunlight. 6 months had passed since Michael's departure. The old house on Maple Street had transformed into a vibrant hub of activity, where the past and present met in harmony. Anthony's office now housed modern technology, but retained its original essence. The wooden shelves still held his books, and the old binoculars occupied a place of honor on the desk. Richard was hunched over blueprints and reports when Helen entered, bringing a cup of coffee. The familiar aroma made him smile. Some things never changed. "The representatives from Green Valley have just arrived," she announced. They brought extraordinary news about the first installed system. Richard stood up, adjusting his tie. No longer Italian, but one made by local artisans, a gift from one of the communities benefiting from the project. "How is it working?" "Beyond expectations," Helen replied, her eyes shining. "The combination of your father's system with the traditional knowledge of the communities is producing impressive results. The water isn't just clean, it's revitalizing the entire local ecosystem." Walking into the makeshift meeting room, Richard found smiling, animated faces. Mrs. Green, one of the oldest community leaders, approached him with a warm hug. "Your father would be so proud," she said, emotional. "The system is doing exactly what he dreamed of. The children are no longer getting sick, the crops are stronger, and even the birds seem happier." Richard smiled, remembering Michael's words about the winged messengers. As if responding to his thoughts, a mockingbird landed on the windowsill, its familiar song echoing through the room. The meeting proceeded with enthusiasm, each representative sharing success stories and plans for expansion. The project was growing organically, just as his father had envisioned, not as a commercial product but as a shared gift among communities. After the meeting, Richard found his mother in the garden, watering the same flowers she had tended for decades. The afternoon sun created golden patterns through the tree leaves, reminding him of that magical moment with Michael on the porch. "Sometimes I still expect to see him sitting there," Helen said softly, following Richard's gaze. "Michael had a special way of making everything seem possible." "He did," Richard agreed, sitting down on the old swing. "But I think the real miracle was helping us see what was already there all along." Helen sat beside him, the swing creaking gently like in the old days. "You know what moves me the most? Seeing how you've changed. Not just coming back home, but coming back to yourself." Richard reflected on her words. It was true. Over the past few months, he had rediscovered parts of himself he thought were lost forever. His old passion for science and innovation, his desire to make a difference in the world, his ability to truly connect with people. "I got another email from Aqua Global Inc. today," he commented, changing the subject. "They offered a partnership again. And I refused, of course." Richard smiled. "I explained that the project isn't for sale. It never was. It's a shared heritage, something that belongs to everyone." Helen nodded in approval. "Exactly as your father always said it should be." A movement in the garden caught their attention. For a moment, Richard thought he saw a familiar figure, a boy in a blue shirt and red backpack, disappearing among the trees. But when he blinked, there was only the gentle sway of the leaves in the breeze. "Did you see it too?" Helen asked, softly. "I think the Guardians are never really far away," Richard replied, remembering Michael's words. "They just wait for the right moment to remind us of what truly matters." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with vibrant colors. Richard realized that, for the first time in a long while, he felt completely at peace. It wasn't just the success of the project or reconciling with his past. It was something deeper, a sense of being exactly where he was meant to be. "I'll make some coffee," Helen said, standing up. "We still have those cookies you love." Richard smiled, watching his mother walk back to the house. On the horizon, the first stars began to appear, and he could swear they shone a little more intensely than usual, as if they too were celebrating the closing of one cycle and the beginning of another. It was a Sunday afternoon when Richard found Michael's final gift. He was organizing the office when an envelope fell out of one of his father's old books, a book about the water cycle, fittingly. The envelope was similar to the one he had received on the New York subway, but this one had something different written on the front. To be opened when the circle is complete. With slightly trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph and a small note. The photo took his breath away. It showed him as a child, sitting on the park bench under the apple tree. Beside him was his father, and behind them, Michael, smiling that enigmatic smile he now knew so well. The note, written in his mother's familiar handwriting, read, "Dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means the circle is complete. Your father's project is alive and growing, touching, lives in the way he always dreamed. More importantly, you've found your way back, not just home, but to your true self. Michael asked me to tell you something. Guardians appear not only to guide, but to remind. Sometimes we need a little nudge to remember who we truly are and what we came to do in this world. The photo in your hands is not just a memory. It's a promise that true love transcends time, that the purest dreams never die, and that there's always a chance to start anew. Your father is by your side even if you can't see him. I am here, more present than ever. And Michael, well, guardians have their own ways of staying close to those they protect. Continue your journey with courage and love, and always remember, sometimes we need to go full circle to discover that the treasure we were seeking was within us all along. With all my love, Mom." Richard looked out the office window, gazing at the garden where so many stories had unfolded. His father's project was now benefiting dozens of communities, with plans to expand to hundreds more. The technology was being shared freely, adapted to local needs, evolving in ways even his father could never have imagined. But the true miracle, he realized now, wasn't the success of the project itself. It was how everything had connected, past and present dreams and reality, loss and reconciliation, into a perfect web of meaning and purpose. Helen entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee. Seeing the photo in her son's hands, she smiled softly. "Did you find his final gift?" Richard nodded, showing the photo to his mother. "How is this possible? Michael is in a photo from over 30 years ago. The Guardians don't follow the same rules of time as we do," Helen replied, sitting down beside him. "They exist in all the important moments, ensuring that the stories that need to be told find their way." Through the open window came the familiar song of the mockingbird. Not just one, but several, like a small choir celebrating something only they could see. "Do you know what your father always said about moments like this?" Helen asked, her eyes shining with memories and love. "What?" "That they're not endings or beginnings, they're meeting points. Places where the past, present, and future embrace, showing that the entire journey was worth it." Richard smiled, carefully placing the photo and note back into the envelope. On his desk, plants and reports showed the future of the project unfolding. On the walls, old photographs told stories of love and perseverance. And in his heart, a certainty grew stronger and stronger. Some stories never truly end, they just find new ways to continue. Outside, the sun began its journey toward the horizon, painting the sky with colors reminiscent of that first afternoon in the New York subway. And somewhere, Richard knew, a boy with a red backpack was still on his mission to reconnect lost hearts with their true purposes. The mockingbird sang once more, closer now. Richard smiled, remembering Michael's words about messengers. Some changes were indeed always on their way, you just had to keep your heart open to receive them. And so in the old house on Maple Street, where so many circles had been completed and so many others were just beginning, the story continued, no longer as a quest for redemption, but as a celebration of love that transcends time and of connections that, even when invisible, never cease to exist.